His family massacred, his honor smeared, he paid with his life on the scaffold under the most ruthless of death sentences. At the Tower of London, Baron Henry Pole was beheaded on charges of conspiring to overthrow the throne. However, the trial record showed a shocking lack of any factual evidence of treason, as he was simply a secluded nobleman strictly obeying the laws to survive an era of brutal royal purges. His death was a terrifying consequence of King Henry VIII's escalating paranoia, where the state ruthlessly tore his family apart to manufacture a treasonous crime that never actually happened. Why would a monarch go to such extreme lengths to stage a legally dubious trial and permanently end the life of a man whose only true offense was the royal blood flowing through his veins? The Tudor dynasty's claim to the English throne was inherently weak. Henry VII did not inherit the crown through a peaceful succession, but rather won it by military conquest. He defeated King Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485. While this victory secured his immediate power, it did not grant him an unquestionable legal right to rule. Henry VII's biological tie to royalty came through the Beaufort family. They were originally an illegitimate branch of the royal line. Although later legitimized by Parliament and the Pope, official documents specifically barred the Beauforts from inheriting a crown. Henry ultimately seized the throne because he had military backing and a distant royal connection. To strengthen his position, Henry VII married Elizabeth of York, uniting the rival factions of Lancaster and York. Despite this political alliance, the Tudor monarchs remained fundamentally insecure about their status. They constantly worried that rivals with stronger, legally sound claims would challenge their authority and overthrow them. The most significant threat came from the Plantagenets, particularly the remaining members of the House of York. Their royal lineage was undeniable and widely recognized as legitimate by the English public. This ongoing dynastic tension in the presence of direct royal descendants created a remarkably dangerous environment for figures like Henry Pole. Born around 1492, Henry Pole was not an average English nobleman. He was a living, breathing political paradox. He carried the purest blood of the Plantagenet dynasty. His mother was Margaret Pole, the Countess of Salisbury. Margaret was not a distant cousin of royalty. She was the direct, legitimate daughter of George Plantagenet, the Duke of Clarence. That made Margaret the niece of two reigning English kings, Edward IV and Richard III. Consequently, young Henry Pole was the grandnephew of two kings. If you followed the deep-seated public perception and the ancient respect for pristine royal lineage before the Tudor conquest, the Pole family's biological claim to the throne was far older and vastly more compelling to the common English people than the Tudor line. Despite the complex legal complications of a past parliamentary attainder against his grandfather, the Duke of Clarence, the undeniably pure blood of the White Rose of York flowed unobstructed through his veins, making him a walking symbol of alternative royalty. In a secure constitutional monarchy, this royal lineage might have afforded Henry Pole immense privilege and respect. But in the paranoid, hyper-vigilant atmosphere of the early Tudor court, his bloodline was a weapon pointed directly at his own chest. For a king like Henry VIII, a monarch who grew increasingly paranoid, narcissistic, and obsessed with securing his legacy through a male heir, the very existence of Henry Pole was an intolerable latent threat. Henry Pole was an adult male with pristine royal blood, living quietly in a kingdom where the reigning monarch was aggressively tearing the country apart just to secure a dynasty. Henry Pole was a biological powder keg. His very existence reminded the English nobility that the Tudors were essentially successful usurpers. Henry Pole was an intelligent, pragmatic man. He was not blind to the lethal reality of his situation. He knew that his lineage was a suspended death sentence, an axe perpetually hovering over his neck. His own grandfather, the Duke of Clarence, had been executed for treason. His uncle, Edward Plantagenet, the Earl of Warwick, had been locked in the Tower of London for 14 years simply for existing, before being executed by Henry VII to secure a diplomatic marriage. The historical precedent was undeniable. Plantagenet blood was fatal. Recognizing this, Henry Pole adopted a meticulously calculated strategy of extreme caution and unquestioning submission. He did not seek to rally the disgruntled Yorkist factions. He did not issue public challenges. He attempted to make himself politically invisible and militarily useful to the Tudor state. He sought to prove that his loyalty to Henry VIII outweighed the danger of his bloodline. Elevated to the title of First Baron Montague in 1514, he spent decades doing exactly what a loyal subordinate subject should do. When Henry VIII required soldiers for his aggressive foreign policy, Henry Pole answered the call. He risked his life fighting in Henry VIII's military campaigns in France in 1513, demonstrating physical loyalty on the battlefield. When the king required aristocratic pageantry to project power, Henry Pole complied. He attended the grand, opulent diplomatic spectacle known as the Field of the Cloth of Gold in 1520, standing by his king's side in France, a glittering prop in the Tudor theater of state. He kept his head down, managed his vast estates in Buckinghamshire and Hampshire, and served the crown without complaint. He married Jane Neville, aligning himself with another powerful but compliant noble family. He functioned as a reliable, high-ranking administrator for the regime. For over 2 decades, this strategy of aggressive passivity appeared to work. Henry Pole survived the early volatile years of Henry VIII's reign. He established a secure, wealthy life for his family. He proved that a man with Plantagenet blood could be a trusted servant of the Tudor crown. But he underestimated the escalating paranoia of the monarch he served, and he failed to realize that in a totalitarian system, passive loyalty is never enough. By the 1520s, Henry Pole, 1st Baron Montague, had established a precarious equilibrium. He was a wealthy, respected nobleman managing his vast estates, serving the king, and carefully avoiding any action that could be construed as claiming his Plantagenet birthright. He had proven his physical loyalty on the battlefields of France and his political loyalty at court. However, in the brutal political economy of Tudor England, survival was not a static state. It was a continuous negotiation. The currency required to purchase the crown's favor was total obedience, and the price of that obedience often involved compromising one's own morality. Henry VIII did not merely demand that his subjects refrain from treason. As his reign progressed and his political objectives became increasingly radical, he demanded that his high-ranking nobles actively participate in and legally validate his most controversial actions. He required them to dirty their hands. For Henry Pole, a man defined by caution, the true test of his survival strategy arrived not on a battlefield but in a courtroom. the political landscape of England shattered in the spring of 1536. King Henry VIII, desperate for a male heir and seeking to marry Jane Seymour, needed to dispose of his second wife, Queen Anne Boleyn. To execute a sitting queen required more than just a royal decree. It required the facade of legal due process. The crown needed to construct a narrative of unparalleled depravity to justify her death. Thomas Cromwell, the king's ruthless chief minister, manufactured a labyrinth of horrific charges against Anne. Multiple acts of adultery with courtiers, incest with her own brother, and plotting the king's death. To ensure the execution appeared legitimate to the English public and to foreign courts, the state assembled a jury of high-ranking noblemen to sit in judgment. Henry Pole was summoned to serve on that jury. This was a devastating moral and political trap. Henry Pole was an intelligent, experienced courtier. He, like almost everyone else in the higher echelons of power, knew that the charges against Anne Boleyn and the men accused with her were fabricated. He knew that the evidence was non-existent, extracted through torture or simply invented by Cromwell's agents. He knew she was innocent of the specific crimes for which she was being tried. But Henry Pole also knew the inescapable and fatal cost of defiance. To vote for acquittal, to stand up in that courtroom and declare the Queen innocent, would be to publicly humiliate King Henry VIII and Thomas Cromwell. It would instantly mark Pole as an enemy of the state. For a man carrying the radioactive blood of the Plantagenets, an act of defiance was a guaranteed death sentence, not just for himself, but for his entire family. On May 15, 1536, inside the Great Hall of the Tower of London, Queen Anne Boleyn stood trial before her peers. Henry Pole sat among the 26 noblemen acting as the jury. The trial was a theatrical production designed to culminate in a predetermined verdict. The Queen defended herself brilliantly, dismantling the illogical timeline of the charges, but the truth had no jurisdiction in that room. When the time came to vote, the peers were polled individually, starting with the lowest-ranking baron. Each man had to stand and publicly declare his verdict. When his name was called, Henry Pole, the first Baron Montague, stood up. He looked at the woman he knew was being framed by the state. He weighed his own conscience against the survival of his mother, his wife, and his children. He cast his vote for her death. He pronounced her guilty of treason, adultery, and incest. He participated in the legal machinery of state-sponsored murder. He traded his personal integrity, becoming a nodding machine for a tyrant, all to buy safety for his family. Henry Pole survived the bloody purge of May 1536. He watched as the Queen and her alleged lovers were butchered on Tower Hill and Tower Green. He returned to his estates, his head still attached to his shoulders, believing he had successfully navigated the most dangerous political crisis of the decade. He had proven his total unquestioning submission to the king. He believed the sacrifice of his conscience had secured his family's future. However, Henry Pole was about to learn a terrifying and undeniable truth about living under a dictatorship. You can fake your loyalty, you can compromise your morals, you can participate in the state's crimes, but you can never change your blood. The fragile wall of security he had built was comprehensively obliterated just months later. And the fatal blow was delivered not by the king, nor by Thomas Cromwell, but by someone who did not even live in England. It came from his own younger brother, To understand the catastrophic betrayal that destroyed Henry Pole, we must look at the trajectory of his younger brother, Reginald Pole. While Henry, the eldest son, was groomed to manage the family estates and navigate the treacherous politics of the court, Reginald was destined for the church. Reginald was a brilliant, intensely intellectual young man. King Henry VIII, fancying himself a great scholar and theologian, recognized Reginald's potential. The king generously sponsored Reginald's education. He paid for Reginald to study at Oxford and then funded his relocation to Italy, the beating heart of Renaissance, learning in Catholic theology. The king invested heavily in the young man, treating him almost as an intellectual protege. Henry VIII's objective was pragmatic. As the king began his convoluted legal and theological campaign to divorce Catherine of Aragon, the crisis that would lead to the break with Rome, he needed brilliant scholars to publicly defend his position. Henry V expected a return on his investment. He wanted Reginald Pole to use his extensive theological training to legally and morally justify the king's divorce and his subsequent brutal usurpation of the Pope's authority in England. Reginald, however, possessed something that his older brother Henry had sacrificed: a fiercely independent, uncompromising conscience. While Henry Pole bowed his head and voted for the death of an innocent queen, Reginald Pole sat in the safety of Italy studying theology and arriving at a starkly different, immensely dangerous conclusion regarding the actions of his sovereign. By 1536, the English Reformation was in full swing. Henry VIII was tearing down monasteries, executing men like Sir Thomas More, and demanding ideological conformity across the realm. The king repeatedly demanded that Reginald Pole return to England, or at the very least, publish a theological treatise supporting the royal supremacy. Reginald stalled for years, agonizing over his loyalties. He loved his country, and he knew his family remained hostage to the king's temper in England. But finally his conscience broke the deadlock. In the spring of 1536, residing safely in Padua, Italy, Reginald Pole sent a massive completed manuscript back to King Henry VIII in England. It was titled Pro Ecclesiasticae Unitatis Defensione. Henry VIII eagerly opened the manuscript, expecting the brilliant intellectual defense he had paid for. Instead, he read his own political obituary. This text was not a polite theological debate. It was a brutal, direct, and catastrophic attack on the King of England. It was a masterpiece of righteous fury. In its pages, Reginald openly called the king's marriage to Anne Boleyn incestuous and filthy. He unequivocally rejected the act of supremacy, stripping away Henry's self-proclaimed title as supreme head of the Church of England. He condemned the executions of Thomas More and Bishop John Fisher as acts of tyrannical barbarism. He went so far as to compare King Henry VIII directly to Nero, the mad Roman tyrant who had murdered the apostles. The manuscript was a devastating intellectual humiliation. But Reginald went further, stepping out of the realm of theology and making a fatal geopolitical calculation that would doom his family at home. In the final sections of the book, Reginald Pole publicly called upon the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V and the Catholic nations of Europe to launch a unified military invasion of England. He urged them to stop fighting the Turks and turn their weapons against the true enemy of Christendom, Henry VIII. He called for a holy war to depose the king. When Henry VIII read these words, The fragile peace that Henry Pole had purchased with his morality instantly evaporated. The king's rage was boundless, fiercely vindictive, and terrifying. The Pole family was no longer just a biological threat. They were the authors of treason. When King Henry VIII absorbed the contents of Reginald Pole's manuscript in 1536, his reaction was not merely anger. It was a volatile, destabilizing combination of narcissistic injury and profound political terror. Reginald had not just insulted the king. By publicly calling for the Holy Roman Emperor to launch a Catholic crusade to depose the Tudor monarch, Reginald had committed the highest possible tier of treason. He had handed the Catholic powers of Europe the exact ideological justification they needed to invade England. But in the midst of his raging fury, Henry VIII crashed into a bitter, undeniable geopolitical reality. The terrible power he wielded within the borders of England stopped dead at the shores of the English Channel. Reginald Pole was utterly out of his reach. The Pope recognized the immense propaganda value of Reginald's defiance. Rome moved quickly to protect him, elevating Reginald to the position of cardinal and appointing him as a papal legate. This wrapped him in the highest, most impenetrable levels of Vatican security and diplomatic immunity. Henry VIII attempted to use international diplomacy to secure Reginald's extradition. He sent aggressive demands to foreign courts insisting they hand over the English traitor. The foreign courts, vastly amused by the Tudor king's frustration, politely ignored him. Driven by an obsession to eliminate the threat, Henry VIII abandoned diplomacy and resorted to state-sponsored terrorism. The crown authorized a staggering fortune-making bounty of 50,000 crowns to any Tudor operative, mercenary, or assassin who could infiltrate Europe and bring Reginald Pole's severed head back to London. Tudor hit squads were dispatched across the continent. They tracked the cardinal through France and Italy, but Reginald was heavily guarded by papal troops and possessed an exceptionally effective intelligence network of his own. Every single assassination attempt failed miserably. King Henry VIII was forced to confront a humiliating truth. He was the supreme head of the Church of England, the unmatched master of his realm. But he could not kill a single unarmed priest living in Italy. This staggering impotence on the international stage triggered a cowardly and pivotal shift in the king's strategy. In the psychological framework of a tyrant, a public humiliation must be answered with blood. If the primary target cannot be reached, a secondary target must be substituted. The mechanism of proxy revenge was activated. Unable to touch the man in Italy who had humiliated him in front of all of Europe, Henry VIII turned his bloodlust toward the hostages he already held within his own borders. Baron Henry Pole, the compliant, careful older brother sitting quietly in London, instantly became the perfect scapegoat. It did not matter that Henry Pole had spent decades proving his loyalty. It did not matter that he had compromised his own soul to condemn Queen Anne Boleyn just to please the king. It did not matter that Henry Pole had written letters to Reginald, begging his younger brother to submit to the king and stop destroying their family. In the eyes of the Tudor state, the Pole family was a single, contaminated biological entity. Reginald had committed treason. Therefore, the Plantagenet blood they all shared was inherently treasonous. The king desperately needed to soothe his bruised ego and the Montague family was going to pay the ultimate price to restore the psychological balance of the sovereign. To execute a high-ranking nobleman who had spent decades serving the state, who had never raised an army, and who had never uttered a rebellious word in public, the state had to drastically rewrite the rules of justice. King Henry VIII turned to the architect of his terror state, his chief minister, Thomas Cromwell. Cromwell set to work weaponizing the English legal system to ensure Henry Pole could not escape. Cromwell's primary tool was the Treason Act of 1534. He morphed this legislation into an instrument of suffocating terror. Traditionally, under ancient English law, treason required a physical act of rebellion. You had to gather weapons, mint counterfeit coins, or march an army against the king. It required physical proof of a conspiracy to overthrow the government. Under Cromwell's new extreme interpretation, the physical requirement was eradicated. Treason now included malicious words. Speaking ill of the king's marriage or his title was a capital offense. But Cromwell went even further to trap the Pole family. He pioneered a terrifying legal concept, guilt by association. The state's argument against Henry Pole was flawlessly circular and mathematically impossible to defend against. They argued that because Reginald was a convicted, outspoken traitor, and because Henry Pole shared the exact same parents and the exact same royal Plantagenet bloodline, Henry Pole inherently harbored a treasonous agenda. If Henry Pole stayed quiet, the state argued his silence was proof he was secretly plotting. If he complained about the weather or taxes, the state argued it was coded rebellion. His very existence was criminalized. Silence was no longer safety. Silence was treason. To build this fabricated case and satisfy the legal requirements of the Treason Act, Cromwell needed words. He needed evidence of malicious intent. Since Henry Pole was too intelligent to speak against the king in public, Cromwell had to extract the words from behind closed doors. Cromwell criminalized private space. A massive, invisible network of spies and informants infiltrated every corner of the Pole family's estates in Buckinghamshire and London. The Tudor intelligence apparatus did not just target other noblemen, they targeted the domestic infrastructure of the household. Everyone from scullery maids handling the laundry to the family's private trusted priest, John Collins, was bought, blackmailed, or threatened with torture. Couriers who carried mail between the estates, like a man named Hugh Holland, were monitored and intercepted. Every single casual dinner table conversation was recorded. In the 16th century, the concept of a private sphere did not exist for targets of the state. If Henry Pole sighed heavily about the changing political climate, it was logged. If he muttered a passing, essentially human complaint about the foul-smelling, weeping ulcers on King Henry VIII's legs, the spies recorded it. If he expressed private sorrow over the destruction of the ancient monasteries, it was documented as sedition. These fragmented, heavily out-of-context remarks were funneled directly to Thomas Cromwell. In Cromwell's office, these scattered whispers were meticulously stitched together. They were exaggerated, amplified, and stripped of all context to construct the framework of a grand, organized conspiracy against the throne. By the summer of 1538, Cromwell had manufactured enough evidence to stage a national security crisis. This fabricated crisis is famously known to history as the Exeter Conspiracy. Cromwell cast a wide net, lumping Baron Henry Pole together with his cousin, Henry Courtenay, the Marquis of Exeter. Exeter was another powerful nobleman cursed with royal Plantagenet blood, being the grandson of King Edward IV. The Crown publicly announced that these men, operating from within England, were actively conspiring with Cardinal Reginald Pole in Italy. The official narrative claimed they were coordinating a massive synchronized domestic uprising that would coincide with a foreign Catholic invasion led by the Holy Roman Emperor. The Tudor propaganda machine went into overdrive, painting Henry Pole and the Marquis of Exeter as imminent apocalyptic threats to the peace of the realm. Yet, when modern historians examine the legal records, the interrogations, and the state papers regarding this supposed plot, the reality is stark and chilling. There was a striking absence of physical evidence. There were no hidden stockpiles of pikes, swords, or gunpowder discovered on the Pole estates. There were no mercenary armies being rallied in the dark corners of the English countryside. There were no intercepted battle plans or secret maps detailing how they would overthrow the king. The Exeter conspiracy was a ghost. It was a pure state-sponsored fiction designed specifically to provide legal and political cover for the extermination of a rival bloodline. However, to legally execute peers of the realm, Cromwell still required sworn testimony. He needed a witness from inside the family to validate the phantom conspiracy. Knowing that Henry Pole was too stoic to crack, Cromwell locked his sights on the weakest link in the family chain, the state prepared to tear the Pole family apart from the inside out. Thomas Cromwell was a pioneer in the application of state terror. He understood that extracting a false confession from a hardened, disciplined nobleman was a time-consuming and often unsuccessful endeavor. Baron Henry Pole was a veteran courtier. He was stoic, legally savvy, and acutely aware of interrogation tactics. He would not crack under standard questioning. Cromwell bypassed the eldest brother. He surveyed the architecture of the Pole family and locked his sights on the weakest structural point. The target was the youngest brother, Geoffrey Pole. In August 1538, Tudor intelligence officers intercepted clandestine communications. A courier named Hugh Holland was caught attempting to move messages across the English Channel. The communications linked Geoffrey Pole to his exiled brother, Cardinal Reginald Pole. Geoffrey was immediately seized by state agents and transported to the Tower of London. Cromwell's psychological profiling of his prisoners was clinical and modern in its ruthlessness. He knew exactly who Geoffrey Pole was. Geoffrey was not a soldier like Henry, nor a brilliant theologian like Reginald. He was impulsive. He was prone to crippling, paralyzing anxiety. He was drowning in financial debt. Most importantly, Cromwell recognized Geoffrey's ultimate vulnerability. He had a wife and 11 young children relying on him for their physical survival. Geoffrey presented a perfect psychological target. The Tudor state did not need to use physical instruments of agony to break Geoffrey Pole. The rack, the manacles, and the scavenger's daughter were left in the shadows. Instead, the interrogators, led by ruthless state officials like William Fitzwilliam, deployed a devastating campaign of what modern intelligence agencies term white torture. They aimed for total psychological destruction. First, they implemented a devastating level of sensory and social isolation. Geoffrey was plunged into a dark cell. He was severed from the outside world. He received no letters. He was granted no visitors. The state deliberately withheld all news regarding the safety of his wife and his 11 children. Once he was sufficiently softened by the agonizing silence and the terror of the unknown, the interrogations began. The interrogators did not beat him, they talked to him. They painted vivid, hyper-realistic pictures of the legal mechanics of treason. They explained exactly what awaited him if he refused to cooperate and implicate his older brother. If Geoffrey did not confess, he would suffer the full, legally mandated traitor's death. He would be hanged until almost dead, cut down while still conscious, his genitals severed, his stomach sliced open, and his intestines pulled out and burned before his own eyes, before his body was hacked into quarters. But Fitzwilliam and Cromwell knew physical pain was a secondary fear. They applied leverage to his real vulnerability. They detailed the legal consequences of attainder for his family. They promised him that upon his agonizing death, his wife and 11 children would be stripped of all property, titles, and wealth. They would be legally classified as the family of a convicted traitor. They would be cast out of their estates and forced into the unforgiving streets of Tudor London to starve, beg, and die as social pariahs. The state presented him with a binary choice: protect his brother and watch his children be eradicated by poverty, or surrender his brother and buy his children's survival. Trapped in a lightless box, physically exhausted, and torn between the sacred ancient bond of brotherhood and the primal urge to save the lives of his children, Geoffrey's mind shattered. The historical record preserves a profoundly disturbing visceral event from late October 1538. Driven to the brink of psychological madness, Geoffrey realized he could not withstand the suffocating pressure any longer. He frantically searched his lightless cell for any possible instrument of escape, reportedly attempting to suffocate himself with the very cushions provided for his bedding, or using a small smuggled blade he managed to conceal. In a final, agonizingly desperate act of defiance, Geoffrey forcefully attempted to take his own life, wanting to rapidly end his suffering and permanently silence himself. He recognized that his own death was the only logical escape from the impossible choice the state had forced upon him. He wanted to use his suicide to seal his family's secrets and permanently remove himself as a pawn from Thomas Cromwell's chessboard. But the Tower Guards heard the struggle. They intervened immediately. They restrained him, stopped the bleeding, and saved his life. In keeping him alive, the state stripped away Geoffrey's final desperate shred of control. He could not even dictate the terms of his own death. His resistance was fundamentally destroyed. Having accepted defeat, Geoffrey poll broke. In late October 1538, he began to talk. Geoffrey surrendered the private, intimate complaints his brother had made behind closed doors. He traded things said in strict confidence between flesh and blood for the lives of his children. He testified to the interrogators that Henry Pole had once muttered in the privacy of his own home, "I like well the proceedings of my brother Reginald." He testified that Henry had complained about the state of the government, stating that knaves rule about the king. He claimed Henry had expressed sorrow over the brutal execution of the Catholic martyrs. These were not battle plans. They were not coordinates for a foreign invasion. They were the frustrated, private whispers of a terrified man living under a dictatorship. But under the Treason Act of 1534, they were lethal. By extracting these specific words, the state had successfully turned a brother's love into a sharpened judicial weapon. On November 4th, 1538, armed exclusively with the confessions ripped from the broken mind of Geoffrey Pole, the Crown officially arrested Baron Henry Montague. He was taken to the Tower of London alongside his cousin, the Marquis of Exeter. As Henry Pole sat in his cell waiting for his inevitable death, the true psychological horror was not the fear of the executioner's axe. He was a veteran of the French campaigns. He had faced the prospect of death before. The true horror was the crushing, devastating realization of how he had been caught. He was going to the block because of words twisted from the mouth of the little brother he had loved and protected. The state had not just violated the law, it had assaulted basic human morality. King Henry VIII and Thomas Cromwell did not merely destroy Henry Pole's physical body, they assassinated his faith in human connection. They proved that under unchecked tyranny, the state can force a family to cannibalize itself to satisfy a monarch's ego. In December 1538, the state convened to process the executions. The trial of Baron Henry Montague took place before the House of Lords, presided over by Thomas Audley, the Lord Chancellor. This was a theatrical production designed for public consumption, not a judicial process designed to uncover the truth. The jury consisted of high-ranking nobles, the peers of the realm. These men were terrified. They were acutely aware of the political reality. Thomas Cromwell was watching them. If any peer voted to acquit Henry Pole, they would immediately mark themselves as sympathizers to the Plantagenet cause. They would become Cromwell's next targets. To save their own skins, the peers obediently prepared to condemn a man they knew was innocent of actual treason. Henry Pole was brought into the chamber. He was stripped of all fundamental legal rights. He was denied legal counsel. He was not allowed to cross-examine the witnesses who provided the fragmented quotes against him. He was not permitted to view the documentary evidence. The Crown presented the confessions of Geoffrey Pole. The prosecutors wove the private complaints and the shared Plantagenet bloodline into a grand narrative of a domestic uprising synchronized with a papal invasion. Henry Pole defended himself with the stoicism he had maintained his entire life. He denied plotting against the king. He pointed out the absurdity of executing a man for private words. But logic was irrelevant. The verdict of death was a foregone conclusion before he ever stepped into the room. The jury of his peers pronounced him guilty of high treason. The sentence was handed down. He was to be taken to Tower Hill and beheaded. The cautious, loyal nobleman who had sacrificed his own conscience to survive the purge of Anne Boleyn had finally run out of time. The blood he carried in his veins had caught up to him. The state had secured its legal conviction. Now it prepared for the physical eradication of the Pole dynasty. On the freezing morning of January 9, 1539, Henry Pole, the first Baron Montague, was led out of the Tower of London. He was escorted by armed guards up the incline to Tower Hill, the public execution ground of the Tudor state. A massive crowd had gathered to witness the destruction of the Plantagenet bloodline. For a man facing his final moments, the scaffold might seem like the ultimate platform for defiance. He was an innocent man. He had the opportunity to stand before the public, declare the charges fabricated, and expose the tyranny of Thomas Cromwell and King Henry VIII. But the Tudor state had anticipated this. They controlled their victims up to the very last breath through a grim, unspoken tradition known as the Good Death. The Good Death was a psychological hostage situation. If a condemned nobleman used his final speech to proclaim his innocence, to agitate the crowd, or to curse the sovereign, the state would exact immediate, brutal revenge. The monarch would seize the remaining assets of the victim's family, strip them of their titles, and potentially arrest surviving relatives for complicity. Henry Pole knew the rules of the scaffold. He knew his 67-year-old mother, Margaret Pole, and his young son, Henry Pole the Younger, were still locked within the walls of the tower. They were left at the mercy of the king. To protect his remaining family, Henry Pole had to swallow his bitter fury. He had to perform his final act of submission. Standing before the silent crowd, his breath turning to vapor in the cold air, Henry Pole delivered a forced, compliant speech. He did not claim innocence. He publicly acknowledged the justice of the laws that were murdering him. He played the role of the repentant sinner, and he prayed aloud for the long life and health of the very king who had ordered his death. He had fulfilled his end of the extortion. He handed a few gold coins to the executioner. This was a standard aristocratic bribe, a final transaction to ensure the man's hands were steady. The blade was sharp and the strike was swift. Henry Pole knelt in the blood-stained sawdust. He placed his neck on the heavy oak block. The executioner raised the battle axe and brought it down, severing the spine and ending the life of a cautious, loyal man at the age of 47. Following the strict, gruesome customs of treason, the state claimed his physical remains. His severed head was parboiled in a cauldron of pitch to preserve it against the elements. It was then jammed onto a wooden spike and elevated above London Bridge. It sat there, rotting in the sun and rain. It was not just a morbid display. It was a visible, silent message of terror sent across the sea. The king was telling Cardinal Reginald Pole in Italy exactly what happened to those who defied the Tudor crown. The execution of Baron Montague did not satisfy the paranoia of the Tudor regime. It merely acted as the detonator for a comprehensive, chilling extermination campaign against the remaining Pole family. Thomas Cromwell recognized a structural flaw in his own methodology. Staging elaborate show trials, even with a terrified jury and fabricated evidence, was tedious. It required extracting confessions. It left a marginal, dangerous room for error or public sympathy. Cromwell needed a more efficient mechanism for state-sponsored murder. He found it by bullying the English Parliament into passing the Acts of Attainder in the spring of 1539. The Act of Attainder was a terrifying piece of draconian legislation. It allowed the state to declare a person guilty of treason by legislative decree. It bypassed the judicial system. There was no trial. There was no jury. The accused was not permitted to offer a defense, and the state was not required to present a single shred of evidence. The king simply asked Parliament to declare a target a traitor, and upon the passing of the act, the victim was legally dead and ready for the block. It was legalized, streamlined murder. The immediate targets of the new legislative weapon were the remaining members of the Pole family, locked in the tower. The most tragic victim of this silent eradication was Henry Pole's young heir, Henry Pole the Younger. He had been arrested and locked in the tower alongside his father as a mere child. He had committed no crimes. He had spoken no words against the king. His only offense was carrying the Plantagenet DNA. Following the execution of his father and the passing of the Act of Attainder, the boy simply vanished from the historical record after 1542. There was no public execution on Tower Hill for the child. The state recognized that executing a young boy in broad daylight might turn the stomach of the London mob. Instead, he was subjected to a state-sponsored disappearance. It is widely and grimly accepted by historians that Henry Pole the Younger was quietly starved to death, poisoned or smothered by state agents in the dark recesses of the tower. The regime systematically eliminated the boy to ensure there would be no future threat of vengeance and no continuing male heir to the Plantagenet line. The nadir of this bloodbath, the moment of unchecked barbarism that permanently stained the reign of Henry VIII, occurred on May 27, 1541. The target was Henry Pole's mother, Margaret Pole, the Countess of Salisbury. Margaret had been held in the freezing conditions of the Tower for over 2 years. She was 67 years old. The king had kept her alive as a final desperate bargaining chip, hoping her imprisonment might force Cardinal Reginald Pole to surrender. When Reginald refused to break, and following a minor unrelated rebellion in Yorkshire that triggered a new wave of royal paranoia, Henry VIII ordered her death. She was condemned by an Act of Attainder. She was never granted a trial. Because of her royal blood, her execution was scheduled to take place privately within the walls of the Tower, on the Tower Green, rather than before the public crowds of Tower Hill. When the constable of the Tower informed her that she was to die that morning, she was shocked. She had no warning. She was dragged out to the green, where a small wooden block had been prepared. But Margaret Pole was the daughter of a royal duke. She possessed the iron will of the Plantagenets. She refused to play the role of the compliant victim. She shattered the protocol of the good death. When ordered to lay her head upon the block, she fiercely refused to kneel. She stood upright, looking directly at her executioners. She stated with terrifying clarity that she had committed no treason, she had received no trial, and she would not submit to the block like a traitor. "So should traitors do," she allegedly declared, "and I am none," the elderly countess screamed as the first agonizing blow landed. But she adamantly refused to yield gracefully to the Tudor tyranny. What followed was a scene of profoundly sickening and chaotic butchery, witnessed and recorded with outright horror by contemporaries like the imperial ambassador Eustace Chapuis. The panicked, inexperienced executioner struck her blindly and repeatedly, hacking brutally at her head, neck, and shoulders as she writhed in immense pain. Historical accounts record that it took an excruciating 10 or 11 savage strikes before he finally managed to sever her head and complete the horrifying state-sanctioned murder. It remains one of the most savage, undignified, and horrifying spectacles in the history of the British monarchy. The Tudor state had finally eradicated the last legitimate daughter of the House of Plantagenet. And what of Geoffrey Pole? What was the fate of the broken younger brother whose desperate, extracted words provided the legal ammunition to start the slaughter? Geoffrey was pardoned by King Henry VIII. The state granted him his life as a reward for his lethal testimony against his brother. But his pardon was a living curse. It was a psychological punishment far worse than the swift finality of the executioner's block. Geoffrey walked out of the Tower of London a free man, but he was a destroyed soul. He spent the rest of his life viewed with profound, overwhelming, and unmasked disgust by English society. He was the man who had sold his own brother to the executioner to save his own skin. The nobility shunned him. The commoners despised him. He was tortured by his own inescapable guilt. He suffered from severe chronic depression, teetering constantly on the edge of a mental collapse. He lived in terror of the king and in terror of his own conscience. Unable to bear the isolation and the shame in England, Geoffrey eventually fled the country. He abandoned the family he had sacrificed his brother to save. He traveled across Europe, seeking out his exiled brother, Cardinal Reginald Pole. Geoffrey threw himself at the feet of the cardinal, sobbing uncontrollably. He begged for a forgiveness that could never truly wash the blood from his hands. Reginald, operating as a priest, granted his brother absolution. But a papal blessing cannot erase trauma. Geoffrey Pole could never forgive himself. He carried his living death sentence across the continent, an exile from his home and his own mind, until he finally passed away in 1558, just days after the death of his brother Reginald. The tragedy of Baron Henry Montague and the eradication of the Pole family is a cold, razor-sharp indictment of the Tudor Golden Age. It forcibly strips away the glamorous pageantry, the beautiful velvet gowns, the jousts, and the majestic castles. It forces us to look at the rotting, paranoid core of a regime ruled by a narcissistic tyrant. The Exeter conspiracy was not a legitimate defense of the realm. It was a biological cleansing. Henry Pole died a proxy death. His decades of careful, quiet loyalty, his military service, and his unquestioning submission were erased in a single instant. He was butchered simply because he carried the wrong blood in his veins, and because his sovereign required a scapegoat for his own geopolitical impotence. The fall of the House of Pole stands as a stark, uncompromising warning about the ultimate boundaries of tyranny. It demonstrates the precise mechanics of how a state weaponizes the law to commit murder. When state power resorts to profound psychological torture to break the sacred bonds of a family. When a government criminalizes private whispers. When it forces a brother to destroy a brother just to survive. That is the exact moment the moral soul of a nation is severed on the chopping block. Henry Pole did not fail his country. The English state failed its most basic mandate to protect human life, sacrificing justice on the altar of unchecked power.